This film is part of a series in which we talk to experts about the core concepts in educational assessment and tackle some really tricky issues. This film is about formative assessment and feedback, and we begin by talking to Professor Gordon Stobart from University College London. Gordon started his career as a teacher before moving into academia, and one area of his research has been formative assessment.
I think we need to define assessment before we start. I think if I was asking you to do a word association and I said assessment, what's the first word that comes into your head? I think it might be for many people tests, examinations, but I want to use assessment more generally as gathering evidence to make a judgment. And that means lots of things we do in the classroom and elsewhere is actually assessment. When we're looking at kids who are just staring blankly at us because they haven't understood what we've asked them to do, that's an assessment. We're making a judgment. I've got to do this again. It's not been understood. So assessment in that broad sense. Formative assessment I'm using in the sense that we're using this evidence to help directly the learning process. So to simplify it, formative assessment informs learning. And we might want to contrast that with summative assessment, which sums up learning at the end of a course or something like that. I'm taking formative assessment in this more general sense of gathering evidence, that there are three main elements to this. The first is gathering evidence about what the learner knows already. One of the best ways of learning is to build on what we know already. And so we do diagnostics in the classroom, we do question and answer, we find out what the students know and don't know, and that's what we build on, that's where we start from. So that's the first element. The second element is making clear to our students and to ourselves what is it we want learned in this lesson or this series of lessons. Where are we trying to get to? What's the learning intention? And we try and make this clear. And to do this, actually the teacher has to be clear about why we're doing things. What's the point of this lesson? And try and communicate this to students as well, so they understand why we're doing it. And then the third element of this is the giving feedback that helps move the learner from where they are now towards this learning intention. So we're trying to close the gap at that point between where they are and where they need to get to.
Now let's hear from Daisy Christodoulou. Daisy started her career as a teacher before getting interested in assessment and has written several books for practitioners on assessment.
I think good student feedback has to be something that students can understand and act on. And if they act on it, it will help them get better. And that might sound pretty simple and obvious, but it's actually quite hard to do. So if you think of what's the most common method of feedback, kind of traditionally and even now, what do people think of when they think of feedback? They probably think of the written comment at the bottom of an essay, and that's what we're probably used to. But actually, my argument would be that's not very helpful at all. So the example I always give is, imagine a teacher marking a set of students writing, and they've all written a story. Maybe it's a year 6 or year 7 class. And what if the tense is inconsistent? That's quite a common error with younger students, that the tense slips between the past and the present tense. The teacher can write at the bottom of the piece of writing, you need to make the tense more consistent. What does a student do with that? What are they able to, are they able to, they can certainly read it and maybe understand it, but is that going to help them make their tense less inconsistent next time? So my argument would be that kind of feedback is quite performative. The teacher's done something, the student can see they've done it, everyone can see there's something there, but is it actually helping a student to improve? And I would say a better way of giving feedback in that example would be, actually don't write anything. And if you see it's a mistake that quite a lot of students have made, you can replan the next lesson with an activity perhaps where you've got a passage that's written in the past tense and then say, right, can you turn this into present tense? So turn the story from the past to the present tense, or a passage where there is tense inconsistency and the students have to spot the errors. So it has to be something where the aim is to improve the student thinking, so they're not going to make that mistake next time. And as I say, I think a lot of the time feedback can be quite performative. It isn't aimed at doing that. I think another problem with traditional methods of feedback is sometimes also they can be aimed at just improving the work. So the aim is for the student to go back and re-edit and redraft and edit the work and revise it. But again, that can look very good and it can result in a better piece of work. But does it mean that the student won't make those mistakes next time? Does it mean that their next piece of work will be better? So for me, the aim can't be just to improve the piece of work. It has to be to improve the student's thinking. And all those things are quite tricky. They're not straightforward. But that's what I think makes good feedback.
I should start by saying most feedback doesn't work. It doesn't close the gap. So we've had to work very hard to find what makes feedback more effective. And I think we've come up with a number of things that help with feedback. Though I would say feedback is a skill. You can't just automatically do feedback. You have to think about the learner, where they are, what they can receive. But some of the key things are that, first of all, it's specific and clear, so that we're giving some help that will help move the learning forward. If you think of some of the feedback we give and we get, it doesn't have any information in it, because I'm treating feedback as information that closes the gap between where somebody is and where they need to get to. And a lot of what we do doesn't do this. When we give feedback like try harder, or I like an adult example, you've just failed an interview and I'm going to give you some feedback. Interview better. Okay? You failed your driving test. Drive better. We give kids a lot of this kind of information. Try harder, improve your spelling. All these, it's empty feedback. So what we've learned is that we have to have information in there that gives the learner an idea of what they need to do to improve. A second one is that it focuses on the task rather than on the learner. If we focus on the learner, star student, disappointing, and the like, it becomes reputational. And we've learned that that has a negative effect often on learning. If we focus on the task, we can direct the information at that. Peter Johnson, the literacy expert, says there's a world of difference between good job and good boy. Job is about, it could be a good job, next time it may not be such a good job, and we can say that. So if it's reputational, what happens if you're a good boy this time and you don't do work next time? Are you a bad boy? What happens there? And it becomes a matter of my ego rather than my learning how to do something. So that would be an important one, keeping the focus on the task itself. I think one of the main things that people get wrong is they think feedback is a one-way street. That what we've learned is that it's as important for the teacher to take feedback from the student as it is for the teacher to give feedback. And the danger is we think of it as a gift that we give to our students, and we give them our wisdom, and we're not interacting with them. And actually good feedback is an interaction between students informing us and us informing students. So I think sometimes we don't listen enough or observe enough of our students in this, because we as teachers need to get feedback as well as give it. So the idea of just thinking the job's done when we've said what's needed. And I think that's and leads into another problem with feedback, is that we don't we don't give time for it, and we don't expect something to happen as a result. I would argue that if the student doesn't do anything as a result of feedback, it's not feedback. Nothing's happened. So that becomes important. I think the other thing about timing is that we've to give our students time to do something with the feedback when they get it. There was an interesting study in Norway where they found that if the same feedback was given, if the teacher allowed time for the students to do something with it, they saw it as a positive. If the teacher gave the feedback and then moved on to another topic, they saw it as negative, that it was just criticism of the work they'd done, and therefore the feedback was ineffective.
Of course, a lot of feedback is written rather than spoken. For example, when a teacher marks their pupils' homework. And this has been a particular research interest of Victoria Elliott. She's an Associate Professor of English and Literacy Education here at Oxford University.
One really important thing when it comes to giving feedback is to work out what's actually going on in the student's head, which is actually quite tricky, surprisingly. So, for example, one of the things that the research distinguishes between is the difference between mistakes and errors. And so a mistake is something which the student should be able to do and does know how to do, but they've just made a mistake. So, for example, if they have normally managed to use an apostrophe correctly throughout, and then they've got one or two examples where they haven't, then that's a mistake. And you can just draw their attention to that and they should be able to correct it. And that's a really important thing for marking, is you get them to correct their mistakes because it makes them think about it and it changes their behaviour for next time. The other kind of thing that they might be doing is what's called an error, and that's where you've got a pattern of mistakes which show that there's something going on underneath, which means that they haven't understood something, or that they are misapplying a rule, or that they just don't quite get this. And again, you can actually just show them the fact that there has been a series of mistakes, and you can give them a hint, which might be to point them in the direction of some piece of information, or it might be to show them the underlying rule that is the thing that they have misplaced, the underlying rule, which is the thing that they have not used when doing the work. So to give an example, a classic example in maths would be if they've got the decimal point in the wrong place. And so you remind them of the rules about where decimal points go, you remind them about checking how they've done it, and that means that they can then come back and go through their mistakes, their errors, and correct them themselves. And again, that's really valuable learning and is much more valuable than the teacher just moving the decimal point on the page. There's some really interesting research, which mostly comes out of Germany, which is about what reference points teachers use when they're making assessment judgments in class and when they're giving feedback. And this is what's called the reference norm orientation. And what their research shows is that when teachers use what's called an individual reference norm orientation, that's to say that they are comparing students against their own previous performance and giving them feedback based on that, so saying, well done, this is the progress you've made since last time, this is the steps that you have done, and then these are the next steps you need to take. Then that is better for student learning than the other possibility, which is what's called the social reference norm orientation, which is when they're comparing students to how the rest of the class have done on any given task. And this is really interesting in a number of ways. It seems quite aligned with the kind of goal setting and how people talk about making progress in general, but also there's some really interesting research which shows that students are less likely to cheat if their teachers have an individual reference norm orientation, if they are comparing their progress to the same student's progress over time, than if they are giving them any kind of feedback based on comparing them to a whole class.
So it's clear that getting feedback right is really quite tricky. And feedback is one source of some dissatisfaction amongst university students. Understanding why this is the case is a particular interest of Natalie Usher. She works at the Oxford University Centre for Teaching and Learning.
The National Student Survey has hundreds of thousands of respondents every year, and a trend over time has been that students are generally less satisfied with their feedback than with other aspects of teaching and learning. So, for example, usually 90% or more of students will say that they're really satisfied with the way that lecturers explain concepts, but only 70 or 80% of students will be satisfied with feedback and how it helps them to improve their learning. And there could be many, many reasons for this. One reason might be that lecturers struggle with their workloads and therefore don't feel they have enough time to give the feedback that they want to give. A common pitfall for lecturers, particularly when first starting out, is to comment on absolutely everything about the piece of work. What went wrong with it, what could be better, and what's really important is to try and prioritise those comments and distill them into a few things that the student can do in their next piece of work to look forward to that next piece of work. So David Boud and Elizabeth Malloy have a really nice saying that feedback isn't feedback until it's used to improve learning. Otherwise, it's just helpfully useful information, which I think is a really nice reminder to focus on what students can do next in their work and what's actionable from your comments. And another sort of struggle with feedback can be that lecturers feel like it's all on them, that it's their responsibility to give this amazing gift of feedback that's going to improve students' work. And likewise, students can kind of get into the assumption that it's a lecturer's job to give them feedback to improve their work. But actually, it can be a joint and shared task that students and lecturers do together. One thing that lecturers at Oxford have used that's really successful is to have students complete a cover sheet when they hand in work. So, for example, students can briefly reflect on what they thought went well about the work, what they thought could be improved, and a bit about the process of the work. So it might have questions around, what did you find really challenging this week? What did you find most rewarding about this piece of work? Or tell me about the research process behind this essay, or tell me about how you went about solving this particular problem. So this has loads of benefits. Firstly, it can help the lecturer to prioritise what to comment on and what is really going to help the students in their feedback. So you can even ask students to say, well, what would you like me to give feedback on, particularly if they're a bit further along in their studies. And also, it helps it to turn it into a bit more of a dialogue between the student and the lecturer rather than just being a monologue from the lecturer to the student. Sometimes students misinterpret their feedback. There could be lots of reasons for this. Maybe Winstone and colleagues have done a lot of research around how students interpret feedback, and they found that a lot of the time students lack agency. They don't really know what to do with it or to understand it. So that's another reason why it's really important to make feedback very practical. So to help students interpret their feedback, David Carless and David Boud have this idea of feedback literacy, which is about building students' agency around feedback, helping them to manage their emotions around feedback, and also giving them a wider context as to why the feedback is the way it is. So, for example, engaging students in activities like peer feedback and self-assessment and looking at examples so they can really understand the criteria and where they're going and why the lecturer has given them the feedback that they've given them. Another reason why students might really struggle with feedback is that the terminology is often quite slippery. So, for example, you might have a comment, you need to improve your argument. An argument can mean a lot of things to different people. So Ursula Wingate, a long time ago, about a decade ago, did some research around comparing what first-year students thought an argument was and what lecturers thought an argument was, and they were totally different, completely different. So the activities that David Carless and David Boud suggest around looking at examples and doing peer feedback can really help students to calibrate, to understand what these very tricky terms mean, and so make the most of their feedback and improve their work.
In this last section, let's hear from our experts about their top tips for giving really helpful feedback.
Three things that I would suggest are important for giving good feedback. One is make sure you know what the problem is. So I've got a very good example from a teacher that we interviewed who talked about a student, a primary school student, who wrote 7 minus 2 equals 2. But the problem wasn't that they couldn't do the maths. The problem that was when they wrote 5, they wrote it the wrong way round. So they had got the answer right. Now that's why it's really important to make sure you know what the problem is before you give feedback. Number 2, you need to make sure that both your handwriting is really clear and also that the way you're expressing feedback is understandable by the students who are going to receive it. And the third tip that I would give is that you need to give concrete next steps action so that students can put that feedback into action right away.
To give feedback that's effective, that helps the learning process, I would say you've got to keep it specific. It needs information that will help the student move from where they are to where they need to get to. It needs to be well timed so that it's ideally during the process of the work rather than either at the end or way afterwards when it will be ineffective. And I think to keep the focus on the task itself rather than the student reputation or the qualities of the student. Keep the focus tight.
My top tip for giving good feedback is I really like an approach called whole class feedback, which is all about not actually writing comments on students' writing, but instead replanning the next lesson with activities that will help the students move on. So that's my top tip. Move away from written feedback, move towards sort of actionable activities.
We can only skim the surface of the field of formative assessment in this film, but we hope we've piqued your interest and maybe made you reflect on how you give feedback. If you're interested in watching more of our films, you can find them on the Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment website. The link is here. We hope you find them helpful.